Uh, yeah. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Yeah. Yeah, welcome to our fifth webinar in the series of webinar on scientific writing. This is a very special edition where we are privileged to have one of the top range of journal editors coming to talk to us on how to package our papers. So, and our special guest today is Jessamine Begana. She's a senior executive editor at the Lancet journal. My colleague and regional advisor for infectious health pathogens prevention, Dr. Mori, is going to talk more about her when he introduces her. I also have my colleague who is joining me in this moderation, Dr. Sam Boland. Then, of course, Amarachi Bianuru. We are all together working with the interpreters to make this webinar smooth for all of us to learn from our guest presenter this morning. So I want to go through the housekeeping rules. And Amara, please, yeah, thank you. So before we start, I would want to remind us that this virtual training adheres to the code of conduct of WHO with respect to prevention of harassment, including sexual harassment at all WHO events. Next slide, please. So for you to function effectively, we have enabled two icons in this Zoom platform. That is the question and answer icon and the chat icon. I will request you to use the question and answer, that is the Q&A icon, for questions regarding the topic of today, the topic and presentation of today. Any question you have on the topic and presentation of today, please use the Q&A icon, and the question will be answered either live or notes with response may be given to your question as we go. For the chat icon, please use it for questions relating to IT or logistics concerning the organization of this webinar today. Next slide, please. Interpretation has been provided. There will be interpretation in English, French, and Portuguese. They are all available simultaneously. For you to enjoy the presentation, the session fully, please click on the globe icon at the foot of your screen and make a choice of the language in which you want to hear this presentation. And you get the language, you get your presentation directly in that language. Note that interpretation of proceedings serves to facilitate communication and does not necessarily constitute an authentic or verbatim recording of the proceedings. Only the original speech is authentic. So as much as possible, if you can listen in English, it will be better for you. Otherwise, make do with French and Portuguese. Next slide, please. There is also live transcription. If you want to enjoy that, please click on the show caption and caption would appear on your screen. To close the caption, click on hide caption and the caption will disappear seamlessly. Next slide. With respect to recordings, materials, and feedback, this session is being recorded as it's being presented, and we take your attendance as a consent to be recorded. Recordings will be shared after the session to those who are registered for this session. Session materials, including the recording which I just talked about, will be emailed to participants in the days following this webinar. That is a couple of days after today. As we continue to improve our training program, your feedback is most valuable to us, and we welcome your feedback. A survey will be shared at the end of this session, We highly encourage you to share your thoughts, your feedback, your suggestions, your observations, because your input will help us to tailor future sessions to better meet your needs and expectations. Next slide, please. So now we move to the main agenda. The agenda is fourfold: welcome and housekeeping, I've just done the housekeeping. Then of course there will be the crafting and of the quality paper, which our guest speaker is going to give to us. Then the question and answer, and of course next steps and closing remark. So for question and answer, my colleague Sam Boland will be assisting me in monitoring the screen for questions. But I want to invite, like I said, we have the team lead for infectious pathogens prevention, Dr. Mori Keita. I want to invite him to just say a word of welcome and then introduce our guest speaker. Thank you. Mori, please.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Thanks, everyone. Thanks all for joining us today. On behalf of Dr. Dick Chamla, Program Area Manager for Emergency Preparedness, and Dr. Abdul Salam Gay, Regional Emergency Director, I warmly welcome you to this special session facilitated by the Lancet. I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank Dr. Richard Horton, Editor-in-Chief of the Lancet, for the great support, and Dr. Jessamy, Senior Executive Editor at the Lancet, for kindly accepting to facilitate this session. This demonstrates your commitment to promoting high-quality scientific articles throughout the world. I extend my warmest welcome to all the participants. Your presence here today is a clear expression of your interest in scientific writing, and more importantly, in high-quality papers. I believe by participating in this webinar, we are in the right place and time. Together, we can step up the exchange of ideas and promote best practices. I'm confident you will find new ideas and fresh motivation to sustain your effort in writing quality paper. I wish you a very successful webinar. Thank you so much. Back to you, Joseph.
Yeah, so I was good. So of course, Mori has introduced our guest speaker, Jessamy, Senior Editor of Lancet, who has so graciously accepted, despite our tight schedule, to interact with us today in preparing our manuscript. So I want to invite Jessamy to take over, please.
Thanks so much, Joseph, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad to be here. I'm really looking forward to what I hope will be an interesting and sort of collaborative effort. I'm going to just share my slides now. This working? Can everybody see?
Yeah, it's coming. If you put it in slide mode.
Yeah, that's what I'm just doing. Okay, we good? Everybody can see?
Good, perfect.
Okay, great. So yeah, my name's Jessamy. I trained as a general and a breast surgeon in the NHS for about 10 years before doing some leadership and management in the NHS, and eventually joined the Lancet in 2018 and left clinical practice. And I'm now a senior executive editor there, where I mainly lead on our clinical strategy. I can be found via all of these different channels, and this is my email. So if there are things that you think about during this presentation that you'd like to catch up with me about, please feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from you. So today, I think what we'll try and do is try and make it as interactive as possible. There will be a session for Q&A afterwards, but if there are things that you really want to hear more about, take a note during the presentation and we can go back to them afterwards. I think that's probably easier than taking questions as we go along. I hope it won't be too much of me just talking and slides. And I would just like to preface saying that What I say here is a sort of very Lancet view of scientific publishing. It's not necessarily the right one, and I totally appreciate and understand that there are different ways of knowing and different types of evidence. And we mainly care about trying to improve the lives of patients and trying to be part of the scientific community. So I hope I'll also learn some things from you. We'll talk about the Lancet today. We'll talk a bit about journals and publishing. We'll talk a bit about the roles of editors, what we look for in papers, how to craft a quality paper, a bit more about writing a paper in more detail, and then a little bit on research integrity, which obviously is important to us all. So starting with the Lancet, first of all, the Lancet is a group of 24 different journals now, and we are expanding to have some more. We've got our regional program, and we hope to open a Lancet Regional Africa at some point in the near future. We have are obviously the weekly main journal, which is 201 years old. We celebrated our 200-year anniversary last year. We have an impact factor of 202, which we're very proud of, but obviously there was a lot of COVID inflation there, and we expect that to change as the years go on and we see a difference in publishing after the pandemic. We're a mix of open access and hybrid journals. The weekly journal publishes weekly. The Lancet main journal publishes weekly, but all of our other journals publish monthly. Within the weekly journal, the Lancet main journal, we publish 3 types of main content. So the first one is read sections. So that's research. We publish randomized controlled trials, observational studies, systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and many other types of research study. And we'll go into a bit more detail about what it is that we look for when we're considering selecting papers. And then we also publish our green section, which is commissioned work for the most part, although we do also accept unsolicited proposals where we work closely with the authors going forwards. So these are on a variety of clinical and global health topics, and they aim to be up-to-date, evidence-based, scholarly efforts that will shine a light on different parts of these practices. We also do big commissions and series, which are very much a partnership between Lancet editors and the authors that we work with. And then we have our blue section. So that's correspondence. So if you read something in the Lancet that you strongly disagree with or you strongly agree with, please write into our correspondence section, and it will be assessed by our correspondence editor and be published alongside some of the work that you might be responding to, or you might have another update for colleagues that's more of a sort of, rather than framing a narrative or putting across a new piece of evidence, it's a sort of update. It's something to communicate within the medical or healthcare community. We publish World Report, which is a bit like our sort of news section. And then we have comment, which can be both linked comments and unlinked comments. So our linked comments are about 1,000 words long, and they're linked to one of our research articles. And their aim is to interpret what we've published, to communicate it, to critically appraise it, think about the limitations, but also to think about what's next and to put it in context. And then we also publish unlinked comments. So those either come from us that we commission, or from authors that write in and say, I'd like to write something about the Ebola anniversary or, you know, some other topic. And then we consider that and work with the authors to publication. What's the point of a journal? I think it's a good question, especially now. I think, you know, there are many different types of ways that you can publish your work. You could just put it on a server. You could put it in preprints. You could just write a blog and put it on LinkedIn. But the role of a journal is multifaceted, really. We do peer review, we optimize papers. It's about registration, making sure that you've got something which is scientifically sort of certified and credited within the scientific literature. It's also important for dissemination and preservation for the record, the scientific record. This is maybe a bit of a messy slide, but it sort of describes most journals' layout. So within lots of different journals, they're set up differently. Sometimes you have full-time professional editors like you have at the Lancet. Sometimes you have editors who are advisory board members, that's there on the right-hand side, and they might do a lot of the peer review. The peer review editors then are in the middle, and they might be full-time, they might be also undertaking their professional responsibilities alongside editorial work. Authors, then there's a whole sort of technical editing side who go through the papers and edit each line, and production editors as well, and they do things like formatting and illustrations and layout. So it's a whole kind of a whole group of people working together to get papers published and to get them into the right type of format that will make a big impact, that will resonate with different readers. And that's obviously a sort of historical thing. That's what we believe resonates with people within a probably quite a sort of Western perspective. And that's not necessarily right, but that's still the way that most journals function. So why would you publish? Well, to share new findings, to educate, to express concern or encourage debate. That might be something like a correspondence or a commentary piece where you're trying to light up an argument, you're trying to create a debate, try and get something discussed within the scientific community, to shed light on controversy, to change practice, policy, or the world, to entertain, to advance your career, or to keep your job. You know, there are many different academic programs that are reliant on publishing, whether you agree with that or not. I think the link between publishing and promotion is much too strong and needs to be reconsidered. But historically, that has always been the way of assessing academics. So what do we add at the Lancet? Well, we believe that we're a journal that adds an awful lot of value. We have professional editors that are dedicated to handling your manuscripts, which is not the same as all journals. Many journals are, you know, editors working in the evenings or part-time, so things can be a bit slower. We have a very fast turnaround. We aim to have a negative answer within 24 hours and a decision to review within 48 hours. Anything that's submitted to the family of journals can be transferred between journals. So that time might take a little bit longer because you might submit your work to the Lancet main journal and we might say, well, we don't think it's quite for us. And then we'll discuss it with the Lancet Global Health, who might discuss it with the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health. And by the time it's finished, you've gone through all the different journals and we've tried to find the right home for you and your audience. We have a fast track team. So if you have a trial or an observational study that you really think is absolutely pivotal and needs to be out there very, very quickly, we did this a lot over the pandemic, and we do it with public health crises and emergencies, but also with findings that are novel and perhaps need to be timed to different conferences. We have a fast track team who aim to publish your research within 20 days of submission. That's including peer review, of course. We had a dedicated team of assistant editors, so they go through every line of each paper that we publish and edit it and get it into Lancet style. We have a dedicated in-house media team who make sure that your work is disseminated to all of the most sort of high-profile media outlets and work with you to shape that narrative. We have the ability to coordinate with conferences and events. So if you have an event or a conference that's coming up and there's a paper that you want to publish alongside it, we're always happy to work with you along those lines, and they're often very successful. We have clear processes to pass on to Lancet family if that's desired. So if you, like I said, if you submit something to the Lancet Weekly Journal, we don't think it's quite the right fit for us, then we will discuss it with a family of journals and it might get transferred elsewhere. And we also have preprints with the Lancet. So if you want to get your paper out there straight away, you can always put it on preprints with the Lancet. And then it's online, you can disseminate it, you can publicize it. And at the same time, it can go through peer review to see whether it is something that we want to publish at the Lancet group of journals. We wish and we hope, we think we are more than a journal. We work very hard to do things like commissions and series, to be a leader in healthcare and the scientific community, to try and push for inclusion, diversity and equity, and also to try and improve the lives of people and planet around the world. Some of what we do is to assess research, commission clinical and global health content, to arrange peer review, to lead commissions and series. We write leaders and articles, and we try to be part of the scientific community. This is a bit of a messy slide, but it essentially shows you what happens when your paper is submitted to the Lancet. So I'll just go through it because sometimes people find it interesting to know what's going on internally. So you submit your paper to the Lancet and it gets assigned to an editor and read by an editor. They decide whether it's possibly suitable for the Lancet or whether it's not suitable for the Lancet. If it's not suitable for the Lancet main journal, they'll suggest an alternative journal within the family. That might be the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health. It might be the Lancet Global Health, or some other place. If it is suitable for the Lancet, then it's taken to what we call a pre-review meeting, where it's read by all the other editors and we agree or disagree to send it out for peer review. So at that point, it might then also be transferred to another journal if we think that it's unlikely to make peer review for the Lancet Weekly Journal, or we say, yes, we're really enthusiastic about it. We'd like to see what peer reviewers think. And then we send it out for peer review, and we always have 3 expert reviewers. So we try and make sure that they have a range of clinical and healthcare expertise that match the paper. So for instance, if it was a paper on gastroesophageal cancer, we would try and have a cancer surgeon, an oncologist, and maybe a general medical person. My son is at home unwell, so if at some point in the near future he calls for me, just give me 2 minutes and I'll be back very shortly.
That's fine.
When we send it out for peer review, then we wait for those reviewers. We try and get them in very quickly. Just give me 2 seconds. I have a young son. I'll literally be 1 minute. Sorry about that. So we send it out for peer review, we get those reviews back, and then we take it to a manuscript meeting where, again, it's read by all of the editors within the weekly journal and also all of the editors within the family of journals. So all the other specialty journals also read our papers. If they're interested in it, then they express their interest, and we also decide whether we want to keep it at the Lancet. And in that case, we offer a revision. So then we send it back to the authors with the peer review comments and also with editorial comments and say, please revise along these lines, and then we'll make a decision. And at that point, it's either taken to a manuscript meeting again to make a decision, yes, we want to keep this, or no, we want to transfer it. Or we decide to get it re-reviewed by reviewers to see whether the comments or the argumentation or the issues that have been brought up have been adequately addressed. It's taken back to manuscript meeting, and then we accept it, or we decide to transfer it. So it's a really long process that sometimes these papers can go through, but I hope it shows that there's an awful lot of editorial oversight and a lot of passion behind what we do. And we try and make sure that we're optimizing papers to the very maximum. I'm just trying to move on to the next slide here. I always ask myself 4 questions when I get a paper. Is this a good research question that's suitable to a general medical audience or a general healthcare audience? So it might be, something that's interesting, but very, very niche or sort of mid-story. And that's not necessarily something that we would want to consider at the Lancet. That's the first question I always ask myself. Is this a really good research question? The second question I ask myself is, does the methodology used match the research question? Is this the most robust, best evidence that we could get on this research question? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a randomized controlled trial. It could be a retrospective observational study. If there's no other evidence out there and it's a really crucial question and relevant to our audience, we would still consider it. Are the results believable and generalizable? This is something that's more and more important. And will this change clinical or global health policy or practice? If the answer to, say, 3 out of those 4 is yes, then most of the time we'd send it for peer review, or we definitely take it to a pre-review meeting to discuss it more. So factors that kind of work into whether we would think, yes, we want to pursue this, or no, we wouldn't. So these are some of the positives in a bit more detail. If it's novel, if it's the first and the last, so if it's the beginning of a story, it's the first GLP-1 antagonist that's come out, and this is the big, it's even though it's a phase 1 and it's early, We know that we can see that this could have huge implications. We would be interested in that. Or the last, this is, an IPD meta-analysis of all of the last 7 years of cardiology and SGLT2/1 inhibitors. And we've decided that this will be end of story. We'd also be interested in that. Is it practice changing? Does it challenge convention or dogma? Is it the largest data set with different or definitive results or in much more granularity than we've seen before? Is it a robust methodology? So the most robust data that we've seen so far. We're not just interested in positive results. Some negative results are really important, and it wouldn't be a sort of barn door, well, it's a negative result, we're not interested in it. Of course, clinical trials are more likely to be something that we're interested in because we know that that's the way that we currently view evidence. That is the top level of evidence. Large meta-analysis, a topic that's relevant to a large demographic. So, for instance, if it was something that was very regional, but actually the argument was that the burden of disease in this particular region was so high, then of course we wouldn't mind if it wasn't necessarily generalizable. Messages that are not just regionally or geographically limited, so perhaps a particular experience that's happened in a region that we know could be applied and extrapolated elsewhere. And a lot of it is about timing, the right question at the right time. Things that factor in that are negative, poor research question, inappropriate patient group or endpoint, lack of comparator or an inappropriate comparator. If it's underpowered, it's obviously very difficult to draw conclusions from. That's not necessarily an immediate, that we wouldn't be interested, but it would have to be quite a special paper with a real sort of relevance to general medicine and some interesting findings for us to pursue it. If the study is incremental and it doesn't really share any new knowledge, then that's probably something we wouldn't be interested in. If there's an over-reliance on an ad hoc exploratory analysis, again, that's something that we wouldn't, that would put us off. For predictive tools, if there's a lack of validation in an independent cohort, we must have external validation for any papers that we publish that are like that. And for trials, if there's a lack of registration or retrospective registration, a lack of kind of inexplicably inconsistent outcomes from the protocol and the methodology, that would be a problem. And salami slicing of results, cutting up papers into lots of different types, we also find difficult to, we'd find that difficult to publish. Ultimately, though, what we're most interested in is we're seeking research papers that will make a difference in clinical practice or that could be policy changing, because we are about the best science for better lives. We want to make people's lives better. So I thought it would be worth talking a little bit about you thinking about your paper. And I think, these ones that we talk about here, they could apply to any type of paper. It could be research, it could be a green section or sort of commission paper that's a review, a seminar, a therapeutics article, a series, a commission. But it's worth thinking about some of these questions. And these are the things how I approach it. So, it's about knowing the field really well, doing your usual literature review and your background, making sure that you are always science-led, that you get a really good international collaboration wherever possible, that you have equity in authorship, that it's multidisciplinary, and that aims for transformational change. I think about your audience, who are you wanting to influence? What kind of journal are you aiming for? Are you aiming for a general medical journal? Is the question that you're answering appropriate for a general medical audience, or is it more appropriate for a specialized audience, either regionally or within a particular specialty field? And what are the values, campaigns, interests? What are you trying to do with this research? And then look at what kind of other people have published on this and where it's been published. These can all inform those questions. These are just some things that we often say when we're doing commissions. So Lancet commissions are 25,000 word reports, and they aim to be transformational and to add new data to a field. So these are some of the sort of principles that we say, and I think really you can apply them to any type of paper. And if you've got some of these themes in, you're always going to have a much larger impact. So devise an original idea, provide new data, and use the right methodology. Develop a really compelling story. Stories matter, people matter. And if you can add that into the very best scientific methodology and to robust empirical data, then you're really onto a winner. offer a critical review. You know, what is it that you're saying that's different from what's been said before, and why is that important? Write a bold or startling message. Sometimes reframing something in a different way has an enormous impact. You know, we've seen that with gun violence, reframing gun violence into a public health problem rather than into a sort of violence problem has an enormous impact in the types of interventions that people are willing to consider and to apply. And we've seen, at least, you know, in places like the UK, we've seen big success in public health interventions for things like gun crime, violence, and gang crime. Be forward-looking. It's great to know the history, but that then has to inform the vision forward, and that must always be part of what you're doing. Be inspiring and optimistic. It's very easy to be negative about things, but actually what compels people and what makes change is when there's some optimism and when things are possible. And that is always, I think, a better place to be in terms of interventions. And provide actionable conclusions and recommendations. It's very easy to come up with 24 vague recommendations, but actually no one's going to remember them, and you know, probably not many people are going to read them all. But if you can come up with 4 or 5 really actionable, meaningful recommendations, people will remember them and they will get acted upon. So I wanted to go into a little bit more detail. We've kind of started out very wide, and now we're going into more and more detail about a research paper. So the benefits of a research paper, or the things that you should always try and do with a research paper, is to make it succinct, to describe the key content, make it conceptual, the sort of conceptual point is very clear, and avoid obscure abbreviations, especially for a general medical audience, where you're trying to get across something that people might not know about. You're trying to talk to a general practitioner who's living in Thailand. How can you convey your research to them in a way that they can understand? So when we're thinking about sort of general principles, make it interesting and understandable, be accurate and specific, and be brief and to the point. It's very easy to ramble on, but it's better when you're succinct. So in your introduction, what you should be considering is, where does the field stand? What problem are you addressing? And identifying the sort of solutions and the possible limitations. If you can get that into your introduction, then you're onto a real winner. When you're talking about your kind of methodology and other aspects, these are some of the things that you really, this is your abstract, sorry. When you're thinking about your abstract, make it very clear and easy to understand. Be well organized and logical, highlight the main findings, feature any unexpected findings, provide the statistical analysis, and provide some interpretation. When you're kind of thinking more about the results and the discussion, I think we really, you sometimes get papers where you can't quite tell whether this is an incremental advance or a huge conceptual large advance. And that's what you must try and consider in your results and discussion. You have to make that completely explicit to the reader. This is the first X, Y, and Z, or if it's not the first, these findings show that what we've been doing for the past 20 years is completely wrong, and compare it with published results. Always kind of cite the main scientific publications on which your work is based. That's incredibly important. References play a huge part in what readers are often looking for. If you can go to a field and look at the references and understand what is the best study, what is the best up-to-date research in this area. Avoid excessive self-citation. That's something that's very off-putting. And avoid excessive citations of publications from the same region. Try and internationalize it wherever possible. So in terms of things that we absolutely must have in research papers, we must have ethical improvement statement, we must have a funding statement, we must have a comprehensive declaration of interest statement, and data sharing statements. We always ask for competing interest forms and for author approval. So every author that's listed on a research paper has to sign an author approval form and submit it before we are finally able to accept and publish a paper. These are some, I think we've kind of gone over this in terms of what initial editorial discussion and team opinion happens when your paper has been submitted. So I probably won't go over this one. I think in the interest of time, we should probably move on. When you've submitted your paper and it's been sent for peer review, you get the reviewers back. And that can often be quite a difficult time because essentially people might be criticizing work that you've been, spent a long time working on. And it's really important to approach that logically and sensibly. So what they will discuss is the sort of technical quality of the data. They will discuss whether what you have come up with in your results section actually supports your conclusions. Sometimes you see that there is a field that's very exciting and people have a hypothesis and they're very keen that the results will show that, this is a new drug for X and Y disease, but actually often the data doesn't really support that. And it's important to make sure that when you're thinking about writing your results in your discussion section, to what degree does that data support the conclusions? And then in general, reviewers will give feedback on the level of interest. Is this interesting to people working in the field? Is this really novel? Is it going to change things? And that will be different, but that's what we're really looking for as editors in terms of the reviewers. So an editor, when they've done that, they're going to take it back to a manuscript meeting, but they'll integrate all of that. They'll assess the paper themselves, and then they'll take all of the peer reviews and think about what this means for the journal. Is this something that we think fits those criteria that we want at the Lancet? So we'll have the reviewer's comments, the editor's assessment of the paper, the nature of the anticipated revisions, and the editorial team feedback, and the consistency between related papers under consideration. And then you can go back to reviewers or additional experts for further feedback if necessary. So we've taken it to a manuscript meeting and we've decided, yes, this is something that we want to pursue. We will then convey these messages to you as an author. And if there are things that you're still not clear about, you receive the reviewer comments and actually some of them don't make sense, we're always here on hand to discuss those in further detail and to think about how it is that you can respond to them. So when you are thinking about responding to reviewers, always remember to be polite and civilized, because these comments will often go to reviewers to see them again. And it's much better to really consider them meaningfully. Sometimes reviewers might have got the wrong end of the stick. They might think that actually what you've written is incorrect or isn't relevant, and actually they've missed the point. It might be that your paper is really, really relevant. So when you get it, read the letter very carefully and decide whether any of the suggested revisions can be completed within the time frame indicated. So often editors will give you, say, 2 weeks. They'll say, could you get your revisions back within 2 weeks? Unless we are working towards a particular conference or event, that doesn't have to be a hard deadline. So if you think it's going to take more time, always just email the editor and say, actually, the revisions required look pretty extensive. This is going to take us a couple of months, and that will always be fine. When you're getting to your resubmission, make sure that you include detailed point-by-point sort of paragraphs that are very clear what you've written and what the reviewer's written. Some people do this in different colors. Some people do it in bold and italics, but really make sure that you've taken some time to make that absolutely crystal clear to both the editor and to the reviewer, and make sure that you're responding to their points and then saying in that paragraph where you have made the changes in the paper. So, if someone said, I think that your interpretation, goes beyond the results that you have here, respond to that politely, perhaps use some references to say why you think that's not the case, and then say, but we've added in these 2 lines to page 12 on line 53 to highlight why this is more of an advance than you think it is, or something like this. All of those comments might be subject to re-review. So always make sure that they're, that they're courteous, that they do respond to the reviewers. At this point, sometimes the journal might decide that they don't want to pursue it anymore once you've done all of your reviewer responses, and they might then transfer it to another journal. And this might include, emailing another editor and having a conversation with them. Ultimately, it's always your choice as the author where you want to publish it. And if you don't want to publish it at the suggested transfer, then you can say, actually, we'd prefer not to. I think this one is more about how it might feel when you get reviews that are against, or might feel that they're overly negative. And it's always really difficult and disappointing. But, try and go with it with a clear view, and you can always articulate why those people are wrong. So I think that was all I wanted to say really about that editorial process. You can always appeal the decision. If you think that your paper has had incorrect peer reviews, or that the peer reviewers have missed the point of your paper, or that there's been some process that means that actually, your findings are being missed as a really significant advance, then you can always appeal the paper. At The Lancet, we have a clear appeals process. You can only appeal once, but you can appeal. And in that, you should always write a clear appeal letter and respond to all of the reviewer comments and really make it clear why this is something that should be in the particular journal that you're appealing to. I wanted to say a few words about research integrity. It's obviously completely crucial to the scientific process that we can believe and trust in what we're reading. Last year in 2023, many of you will know that there was the highest number of retractions ever. So 14,000 papers were retracted, and more than 8,000 of these were often linked to journals who might have missed the line between quality and quantity. And this is to a large extent happened because of the open access process. We all believe in open science, but the way that scientific publishing works is that with open access, there's an author payment charge. So for the more papers you publish, then the more payment charges you secure. So there's an incentive there to publish more rather than to publish just quality ones. And so I think what we're seeing with some of these retractions is that perhaps that line has been missed. All of our papers are assessed for plagiarism. So we have in-house plagiarism software. So once you submit to our editorial management, it will automatically go through plagiarism software that will show how much of a percentage similarities there are with other papers out there. If any of these, if they're above about 25–30%, then we would click on the paper itself, and each line is highlighted that has been plagiarized. And if there were large chunks that had been plagiarized, we would go back to the authors and say, please rewrite this. This is not acceptable. It doesn't really become a problem unless it's kind of above a certain, if the whole thing has been plagiarized, then that's a problem. And that would normally mean that we would have to get in touch with the institution of the author that had submitted it, perhaps. We ask every author to sign off that they have had access to the data set. And this is in response to some issues that we saw during the pandemic, particularly the Surgisphere paper that we had to retract. Every author must fill out a declaration of interest form. So if you have financial competing interests or non-financial competing interests, that must be clearly highlighted and transparently reported. Manuscripts must be solely the work of the author stated, and they must not have been previously published elsewhere. We always ensure that at least one peer reviewer is familiar with local surveillance or network databases. So if you're using a local database, we will always try and make sure that one of the peer reviewers is from a local area so that they can say, actually, there's no way that this paper could look at this because this database doesn't collect smoking, or, you know, this database doesn't look at follow-up. And then we would be able to have a much better picture as to the quality of that paper. And we do seek always to obtain peer review from people who are within country. A little bit on generative AI, because obviously that's a huge issue at the moment. We acknowledge that people are likely to use generative AI to enhance their, you know, paper in a way of the language, but we don't think that that should ever be used for interpretation, and it should never supersede the responsibility or oversight of a human. So we do not allow generative AI to be acknowledged, to be listed as an author, but we do always want it transparently reported. So if you have used ChatGPT or some other generative AI large language model, we want it acknowledged in the acknowledgement section, very detailed how you have used it. Have you used it just for the enhancement of language? You know, you've written the introduction and then you've put it into a generative AI and it's given you some, you know, ways of reformulating sentences that are you know, that are a bit clearer, that's fine, but we want it in the acknowledgement section. Everyone has some role to play in research integrity. We as medical publishers obviously have a, you know, large role in making sure that the scientific record is correct and that we help discourage, you know, research misconduct, poor research, whether that's poor research in terms of waste, you know, that it's a question that doesn't need to be asked and that doesn't need to be research here, or if it's a research question that has had falsification or some form of misconduct. And we also work very hard to try and make sure that our research is equitable and responsible, and we have very clear guidance on that. We adhere to a number of different external bodies. So we adhere to ICJME guidelines and to COPE guidelines. And we always aim to highlight those to authors where there may be issues. I think that is the end of my presentation. And that's the end of my slides. I'm very happy to take some questions, to dive into some of these slides in more detail, or to talk about completely different things. I'd love to have a, you know, very open and collaborative discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ismi. This is amazing. My colleagues have been commenting and, you know, and they've been commenting on the chats, appreciating the presentation. It's really amazing. And I'm surprised the turnout today being Monday, which is an unusual day for us to start this. So the turnout is also very amazing. I think they paid very much importance to this presentation. My colleague Sam has answered most of the questions or all of the questions that came up in the Q&A, but I had some questions sent to me directly to ask on behalf of the participants. So one is, two of them are related, the DOI and ethics. So they found, one of them said that oftentimes they want to submit manuscripts to Lancet. They find that they have to process the DOI and the DOI and submit at the same time. Is it very necessary that they submit it at the same time, given the trouble it takes to get the forms completed and not being sure that the paper will be taken forward? Then the closely related question to that is also issue of ethics, that oftentimes they are asked for ethics, but sometimes the exercise or the publication is really about program activity that is being documented, and they did not develop a proposal before writing this paper, so they didn't submit any proposal or protocol to ethics committee. How do they go about that? So I'll leave you to answer this before I take the other ones that are on there.
So with forms, we do know that it's a sort of burden on authors logistically to have to collect all the different forms and submit them. You don't necessarily need them at the stage of submission. What we do need is a statement, particularly for some of our green or our clinical and global health content. We have a very strict competing interest policy for our clinical and global health, reviews, commissions, and series. And that is that stocks, shares, and regular paid employment are a barrier to authorship. And we do that for obvious reasons, that we know that there are commercial interests in scientific publication to enhance reputation, to try and push products. And we want to make completely sure that the commissioned work that we are publishing and the sort of narrative work that we are publishing is free from financial interests. So you don't necessarily have to have submitted all the forms at the time of submission, but you do need, if it's a clinical piece or a red section or anything else, we always need the statement. So that's saying, what each author has or has not in terms of financial and non-financial relationships. That must be there. And then if we decide to pursue, then at some point we can collect those forms. We have to have them before we formally accept the paper, but it can be a process. It doesn't have to be all up front at submission.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes,
does that answer the question?
It does.
Okay.
So the other question is on the ethics. Assuming the colleague is asking that oftentimes journals insist on ethical clearance, but sometimes the work is about the day-to-day, the routine activity of the program, which they want to publish, for which they did not develop any standard protocol submittable to an ethics review committee. What do they do in this situation?
Well, we obviously follow ICJME and COPE guidance on ethical consent, which is required for individuals in the Helsinki Declaration. If it's something that doesn't use any of that data or doesn't require individual consent, then you can have a conversation with the editors about clarifying that. In general, it's always better to get ethical consent when it's necessary. And within an institution, we would hope that there would be the possibility for authors to be able to discuss with an ethical board about whether what they are undertaking is ethically approved. Obviously, if that's not possible because of the institution, then I think it's fine to have a conversation with the editors about that, and they can make it an internal decision. In those situations, more information is always better, and also trying to articulate what it is that you've done to overcome that barrier of not having an ethical board perhaps in your institution. What other processes have you undertaken? Link it to ICJME, link it to COPE, link it to the Helsinki Declaration, that mean that you've tried to mitigate the risks that could have occurred because of it. Does that make sense?
Very much so. Very much so. I think I've had personal experiences, and I've tried to convince the editors why we do not have ethical clearance. And where the paper is reviewed and found not to be injurious to any interest, they've just asked to put a statement that by the institution's requirement, we did not get this. So thank you very much for that. So before I go back to the list of questions I have here, there's a new question in the Q&A. Paul Ebusu is saying that, where is the place for program-based papers? There is a lot of program work done. Well, this is how it is written. I don't really know.
Is that like implementation work or,
yes,
or like health systems work?
Health system implementation work. I think he's talking about things. For instance, if we talk of health emergency, we have a lot of call it assessments that are carried out. Like you have the action reviews, after action reviews, intra-action review, all of those things about outbreaks, so these are program documentation that we have in the office, and we think that publishing them will be beneficial to global public health. So I think that is the question he's asking there.
Well, I think many of our journals are becoming much more interested in implementation science. You know, the Lancet Global Health in particular have recently published an editorial expressing their interest in this field. So that's, you know, always a good bet. Equally for, you know, the Lancet Weekly Journal, if there was something that fits some of the criteria that I discussed in terms of novelty, you know, generalizability, first or last, or, you know, best data out there, that's really crucial to a broad audience, then we would always consider it also. Sometimes when things are very regionally based, or they're very, you know, they're an important part of the problem, but they're sort of still within the story, this being like the first thing that's ever published and this being the last thing, then those are often, you know, better for a more specialized audience, either regionally or within a specialized audience. So we have a range of different journals that cover, you know, hematology, gastroenterology, oncology. So depending on what the program work was, you could always consider those as well.
Okay, thank you. I will invite my colleague Sam to help me with the next question, which is written in French. Sam, please, can you read that question, please? It's written in French.
Yeah, of course. The one you mean from Hamsatou Cissé.
Yeah.
Of course. So the question from Hamsatou essentially asks whether there's a partnership in that exists between WHO and the Lancet related to facilitating the publication of articles.
We have no formal relationship. Obviously, we take the work of WHO extremely seriously, and we value them as a partner. So when we get papers that are published by WHO, you know, we do make sure that we pay extra special attention, but we have no formal relationship.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, Jessamy has answered the question. We have no formal relationship, but somehow when we call upon Lancet, just like this, they respond to us because we would say we are partners in the same area of work, which is promoting public health. In terms of publication and science, Lancet seems to be leading that route. In terms of delivery and guidance to countries, of course, WHO is leading that route. So we are more or less a partner in the same subject, so we can easily work together. So there's a question, please, from another colleague. Say, could you kindly, I'm sorry, it's trying to take you back, although I have some other questions that were written down here. He said, could you kindly reiterate what really should go into introduction vis-a-vis discussion section for a Lancet paper?
So in the introduction, this is where you need to get the reader or the editor engaged in your particular research question. So you should lay out the context of why this is important and where the field is, where the gaps are, and therefore why you've decided to do this study and what it adds. So the best introductions for me are perhaps, you know, only a page long of A4 or less than an A4 page, and they very clearly articulate what the problem is, what's missing from the current evidence, and how this study is going to fill that gap. They don't need to be particularly long. They don't need to review all of the different evidence that's out there already. They can summarize it, but make it really crystal clear what it is that this paper is filling. What gap is it filling? What research question is it filling? And really that's all that the introduction needs to do. So it could be something about breast cancer programs, you know, that breast cancer, so you might start with the epi of breast cancer, the burden in your region, how treatment's currently given in your region, but there's no evidence on metastatic breast cancer, and there's no registries on metastatic breast cancer. This paper aimed to fill that gap by collecting prospective data on metastatic breast cancers from the year 2015 and following them up to 2024 or something. And that would be fine for the introduction. With the discussion, that is where you really need to begin with, just summarize what the results are, what it is that this paper shows, the mass, the big advance, the main findings. So that's if it's a trial, that's the primary outcome and the relevant secondary outcomes in quite clear language, more clear than you can often write in the results section. This is the first randomized control study that compares X medication with Y medication and shows a significant benefit for the outcome of Z. That should be like the first line of your discussion. And then you can go into the other papers and research that's out there. So you can say this paper, takes us forward from previous research because it's the largest study, because it has a much harder primary outcome than previous studies, and because it's the first study that has a positive outcome. In 2012, such and such did a study that was on a similar issue, but they used a much softer outcome. This kind of thing. And then, bring it all together into a conclusion. So we need to change clinical practice now, this sort of thing. I don't know. Does that help?
Oh, it helps. It helps. It helps. Yeah, it is very clear that we said it in I think the very first or the second seminar in November or December, that in the introduction, you create a niche and you show what is existing about that niche. Then, of course, you now show what is missing, what is the gap. And then you conclude with what you want to do to fill the gap.
Exactly.
So that, which is different from discussion where you say, okay, I have done it. This is what I found. Now how does what you found relate to what is existing, or how does it deviate from what is existing? Then you have to argue and give reasons why you have. So, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry, the person that asked the question is not able to unmute and speak. Otherwise, maybe he would have indicated whether. But again, you have given your address. So please, if you don't mind, if they decide to follow up, yes, please. So somebody joined late and he's sorry for joining late. And he said he had the question on ethical clearance. Let me read in his words. I thought editors need to see that clearly for every research before being considered for review and publication.
Yeah, so that would come up in our checks. So when we in that first stage that I described, when an editor's assigned a paper and they read it, they're looking for different things. If it's a randomized control trial, they have a look at the protocol and they do what we would call a protocol check. If it's an observational study, they look, for some other things. But we'd always check that ethical approval before we took it to a pre-review meeting. If that ethical approval wasn't there, but we were really interested in the study, we would go back to the authors and say, there's no ethical approval. Could you just tell us what's happened here? Equally, sometimes when there's late registration for a clinical trial, we would go back to the authors if we were really interested in the topic and say, this has been late registered. Have you got a clear reason for this? Because sometimes it might be a fault of clinicaltrials.net that they haven't, updated it quickly enough. You've submitted your form, but it didn't get posted until much later, or, something like this.
Yeah. That is it. So if I add to that, maybe just to clarify why the question, I think the participant that raised that question asked the question because not every paper, not every intention to publish results from research. They're talking about program work, and you think in the process of your program, in the process of implementation, you have found out things that you thought should be disseminated, documented and disseminated, like lessons learned in response to maybe one outbreak and stuff like that. So how do you go about the ethics? And that is what Jessamy discussed with us before, that we need to discuss with the editor and maybe get to a point where it is admissible and the paper can be considered. All right, thank you very much for that. But Sam, I don't know if you have questions from your experience that you want Jessamy to touch on behalf of the participants, please.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much, Professor. I have, I'm sure, quite a number of them, but off the top of my head, I think one thing which is always good to get a point of reflection on would be to ask whether there is a sort of top few reasons that you might choose to pass over an article rather than to consider it for your journal. And of course, that could exist in multiple different categories. It could be the content, it could be sort of ethical questions, it could be something else. I know that this is maybe rehashing some of the things that we've spoken about, but what would be the things that you say come to mind when you see something come across your plate and you decide, not this time?
I think the main thing is is mid-story. So if this is something that is in the middle, we have this phrase that editors use a lot, which is mid-story. So if this is an incremental advance that's important for the field, it might be that it's like a slightly different drug used for a particular medication. It might be that it's an observational study on a really crucial topic, but that actually it only adds 2 years extra of data and the conclusions are similar to 2 years ago. Or it might be that, you know, it's a sort of follow-up of something that might be, you know, really, really interesting and important, but it's actually, we know it, and it's only a very small advance. It's very difficult for us to feel that that's something that we should pursue at the Lancet. So I think that's the top one. If this is first, if it's last, if it's the very best data that's available, those are very strong indications that we would pursue it.
Thanks, I appreciate that. It's another question, which is maybe a bit more of a logistical one, but I think is again related to trying to assess and to understand the kind of approach that you might take as an editor. I'd be curious to know to what extent you're able to have flexibility and adapt when it comes to people that are writing in English as a second language, and to what extent the sort of caliber of how clean and crystal that language needs to be if people are submitting from a non-Anglophone country.
It doesn't need to be at all. We're very lucky at the Lancet to have, you know, 100 or more internal assistant editors who will make the language perfect. We don't worry about that at all. We do not bias or judge it in any way. We completely understand the unnatural nature of the fact that English is the dominant language, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. I think where it does make a difference is in that clearness of being able to convey what this is, even if it's, you know, doesn't have to be in good English, but if somebody can clearly convey why this is an advance and why this is important, then that will help. It is sometimes difficult when it's quite hard to understand it at all. And obviously, you know, as we progress down the line of generative AI, all of that might change and language barriers might become, you know, much less of a problem. But for now, for us at the Lancet, it is for many journals, but for us at the Lancet, we don't consider it in any shape or form a barrier. And we encourage people from all over the planet to publish. And I also did just want to say, you know, sometimes the sort of bias that we have about trying to publish in a top tier journal, I mean, I don't like that term, but, you know, that's how we view things, is more about what we feel about ourselves than about what's actually there. We are always looking for new voices. We're always looking for people to write comments for us or correspondence for us or be involved in commissions and series. And often building those relationships with a journal is a really great way to get exposure to different parts of the scientific process. And then that leads on to research papers or to other things. So please reach out to us. Please use my email.
Thank you very much. Sam, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. I was going to turn to the question that is in the
go
chat.
on, please. Okay, yes, there's a question. Go on, please, yeah.
Sure. So there's a question that has come through in the chat in the Q&A. It's sort of two parts. So I'll give you both, but I'll make sure to reflect on your answer and can come back to you with the second one if you would like me to. The question essentially asks whether there's a maximum and a minimum number of references that would be expected in an article for publication. And then the second question would be for a novel research topic that has very, very few articles in which there are to reference, therein making it difficult to reference many articles. How would you sort of guide someone to understand how to appropriately reflect the status of the literature base in a way that would be compelling and sufficient to your journal?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you can look at this in two ways, from a research perspective and from a, other types of content that we publish. So from a research perspective, obviously, when there isn't much research out there, that often means it's a novel or burgeoning area. What we use references for is to reference fact rather than opinion. So if in your introduction, when you're trying to make the case, you need epidemiology there. And there is often epidemiology on most things, even if they might be old references or, there might be inadequate epidemiology. There is always some form of methodology. So it might be that you're saying that your research is better than previous research because of the primary outcome that's been used. And even though there might be only one other study that's looked at this particular topic, you could still reference a methodological paper that talks about different primary outcomes. So you can use references from other fields to bring in where you need to reference fact. That's what you're doing when you're referencing. You're not trying to reference opinion, you're trying to reference fact. So we would look at the references because in the introduction, often people say, all previous efforts have been inadequate and this is the best study so far. And then there might be 4 or 5 references. Now, if I go to those references and they've all been published in the last 3 years in JAMA, the New England Journal, and they're all national observational cohorts that also have around 500,000 people each, and yours has 800,000, then that's, that to me is saying this is mid-story rather than this is, really, really novel or a huge advance. So we wouldn't ever hold referencing against people, but it is a very important part of the scientific process for this ability to reference fact. Where are you getting your scientific facts from? You don't need to do that for opinion. And so when we're talking about things like commentaries and correspondence, we want those facts referenced, but we also want your opinions. So they tend to have only 12 references or, even fewer for correspondence. Does that answer the question sufficiently?
I think so. And I think it's a very important and compelling answer. My bias of myself as a public health researcher is very much in the multidisciplinary social sciences. And so you are very frequently, as you say, really needing to reflect on and draw on from often quite an array of fields in order to really appropriately convey the complexity of the public health problem that you're looking at. And so I think that making sure and being in a position to show that a problem is understood as not such a sort of concrete, specific issue, but does have these wider reflections, which I would think probably also help with your mid-story, your sort of so what, how do we really convey and show the meaning and the importance of what we're doing, would necessarily mean trying to take quite a holistic view of making sure that there's real reflection there. I suppose a sort of slightly not left field, but slightly different kind of question I would love to ask would be what you see and what you understand as the future directions within your team and with the journal. Where do you kind of see things going? Where are the ways in which you'd like to grow or the directions that you'd like to take? And if you are able to comment a little bit, in what ways might that sort of, if you can tailor that answer to the audience here coming from predominantly the African region, that would also be really interesting to hear your thoughts on.
Thanks so much. It's a great question. I think scientific publishing faces some really major challenges in the coming years. One of them is the open access issue. So nobody can argue against the benefits of open science. It's absolutely crucial and important that everybody has access to, new scientific findings. Where it becomes tricky is in the implementation and in the sort of value add. So as we spoke about during the research integrity part, there is a real correlation between open access and quantity versus quality. And so if everything is going to move to open access, we need to find better ways of making that model work, both for scientific publishers, but for readers and authors as well. Some of the author publishing charges are astronomically high. They are inequitable for authors in high-income countries and in low and middle-income countries. At The Lancet, we will never use an APC as an excuse to not publish something. So if you have your paper accepted in a Lancet journal and you cannot pay the article processing charge, we will always waive it if there are no funds. But that's not the case everywhere. So I think that's the first major challenge that scientific publishing faces, and at The Lancet we face that too. And no one has the answer at the moment. It's something that we have to navigate. And I think the second thing is about generative AI and what that means for scientific publishing in general. I think the first question is, how do we make sure that what we're reading is real? Because as we've seen over the last year with generative AI, you can create a false data set based on a false hypothesis. And that can only really be clearly identified when experts are going through each and every line of data. So this is going to become a more and more ubiquitous thing. At the moment, paper mills, which I don't know if anybody is aware of, but they're very sort of nefarious businesses that sell authorship and create falsified and often nonsense papers to get published. I think in some ways the generative AI movement will break that business model, because you won't have to pay anybody to create falsified data. You'll just be able to use a large language model to do it. But then how do we as scientific editors and as scientific journals make sure that what we're reading is real? And that's really going to difficult. It's going to become a huge challenge. So we must focus all of our efforts on risk management and research integrity. And then the second question that the generative AI kind of movement raises for me is, to what extent do we want journals to be human entities? Historically, journals have always been very human, and they're based on the people that work in them and their interests in terms of the work they commission and on what they select. You write something that an editor has a particular experience or interest in, and it's probably more likely to be selected. Now that might not be what, that's not good. And in many ways, the inclusion and diversity of journals has been criticized for that very reason, because we so acutely reflect the people that work in them. And for the most part, those are people based in Northern Hemisphere, and white men and women who are in medicine and not necessarily in other in other healthcare specialties. So there's a lot there. So to what degree do we want journals to be human, or do we want them to be robot journals for robot readers? We have a real problem with research waste. We have a real problem with scientific information that we haven't been able to solve. No one's able to keep up with all of the different research that's out there. But AI and generative AI is very well placed to wade through all of these millions of data points. And already, pharmaceutical companies are using generative AI to go through thousands of abstracts a week and come up with new disease modifying drugs that they could use in different settings. So, is that something that we see in the future? I don't know. Nobody can predict the future. At the moment, human editors and human oversight remains completely crucial. And I believe that, at their best, really, journals are very human, and they should be a sort of an expression, almost like an artistic expression of science, and they should be inclusive and creative. And that's not always the case. A lot of journals don't add any value. But if we're going to, live up to that kind of ideal, then we must make sure that the peer reviewers that we're using, that the authors that we're using, that the research that we publish is relevant to everyone and is inclusive. So we have to have a real conversation about knowledge. Is the way that we are grading evidence in terms of randomized control trials and is it valid? Does it really make a difference to people across the world? Or is it just a very, white supremacist Northern European agenda that doesn't fit everywhere? We have to have that conversation. We have to understand the implications of those different aspects. And we as editors and as scientific journals have a responsibility and a real need to make sure that we're much more representative of the world, of the globe, of different people in different parts, that the things that we publish are much more representative, and that we have really strict measures on including peer reviewers, including authors that reflect that representation in a way that we never have done before and is still very challenging. Sorry, I've gone on a bit there, but
Yes, so I
okay.
think that's a fantastic answer. And I think that,
All
as
right,
well, go ahead, Prof.
Sorry, thank you
Trying
very
to jump in.
Thank you very Paul was coming in. I understand there's a hand up. I'm sorry, the questions are just too many.
no, it's great, love
the
it.
interest, So I have somebody, Adija Amani. Please, can you unmute here? You unmute yourself and speak. Amani, please.
Thank you.
Go on, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we
Really
can hear
well.
you.
Okay, first of all, I really want to thank Prof. Joseph for calling the Lancet in the house. I think this is one of the best learning series that I'm following. So thank you for this. For Jesame, I personally think that I've developed a fear of submission to Lancet because so many of my papers have been rejected. And I just want to find out from you, is there a possibility of working with the editorial team at the beginning of the process, which means that we have an idea? Like now we are working on introducing malaria vaccines in many countries. There's a lot of interest. Malaria vaccine is a game changer. But how is there a possibility that we work together so that we put together maybe not the protocol, but everything in place to make sure that at the end of this process, the likelihood of the papers to be accepted in the Lancet has increased? So really want your thought on this. Thank you. And
Adija, I'm sorry that you've had so many rejections. We don't work closely with authors at the beginning of a research study. We do work very closely with authors in our commissions and our series, and we try and do that as a partnership. And we do also have many other ways that we try and work with authors in commentaries and correspondence, but we don't tend to get, involved at the very early stages of research. That's not to say that it can never happen. But at the moment, that's not what we tend to do. We do always open we run a very open system. So if you would like to join us for a manuscript meeting, and it goes to anybody on the call today, you're always welcome to email me and join one of our manuscript meetings that happen on a Tuesday afternoon or a Thursday morning and hear how we talk about papers across the group. So obviously it has to be confidential, but often researchers find that a very useful insight into the types of conversations that we're having, and therefore it shapes their research. And I would also say, please reach out to me, and if you're working in malaria vaccines, I'm sure we'd love to hear from you in correspondence and commentary, and build different relationships with you. I don't know if that answers your question or is satisfactory.
Adija.
Thank you. I think I will email you as suggested. I really appreciate, and we'll take it up from there. Thank you.
I also would like to encourage you, Adija, because this introduction of malaria vaccine is a big thing, and Lancet goes for the big things. So I will encourage you to maintain some communication with Jess and see what comes out of it. Jess, please, just maybe one last question. Somebody had asked, I wanted to, I thought I could omit that, but okay, Adamu, let me take somebody. Yeah, Adamu, please. Usman Adamu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof, for giving me the opportunity. And Jasmine, thank you. So good to be part of this. I don't know, sorry, I joined late. And I had unstable network connection. About the ethical clearance, I was thinking that is taken for granted for every paper. Sometimes to even go as much as verifying the ethical clearance before going ahead.
That's
by the
true. That's
auditor.
true. It is
Will
completely.
you consider?
I was just answering a question where someone was saying that
Okay.
in some institutions and setups, there isn't any process for
Okay.
ethical improvement. And I was just saying that if that has been the situation, it's obviously not ideal, but you can reach out to editors to talk about it so that they can make an informed decision.
Okay.
Yeah, so Usman, we tried to answer that question before. So you are right. Ethical clearance is, I think in most cases, it's not negotiable.
Absolutely.
It's very, very critical from the start, but we are talking of exceptional situations where people start implementation. They did not develop a research protocol, but in the process of implementing their program, they found information that they think could be useful to the global public health and want to document and publish it. Something like lessons learned and stuff like that. So what do we do? So that we've asked that question, and just like what she said, ethical clearance is very critical, but when we have such exceptional situation, we may need to discuss with the editor and get the informed decision on that.
All right.
So maybe the last question, because I think I'm sure your boy will be, I'm sure your boy will be disturbing now. We have taken you away for too long. So there's a question I do not, because I want to give everybody opportunity to. Somebody had asked, do we also interpret findings in discussion?
Yes, definitely. And
That's
I think
exactly
there's that slide, there was a slide there about how reviewers and editors often talk about kind of over-interpreting in the discussion. So that's the line that you have to walk. You have to reasonably say, is what we've seen here due to chance? And what's the likelihood there? If it is a bit due to chance, and the reality is there are some signals, it looks positive, but it's not categorical, then it's always better to be transparent in that rather than to over-interpret the results and make them seem stronger than they are. But yes, the interpretation is a crucial part of the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe the very last, somebody just sent me a WhatsApp. He said, can we have the list of journals they are working with? That is the family of journals Lancet works with. So
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be on our website, and I can send it afterwards via email.
Okay. All right. Amarachi, I don't know if any other person has a hand up. I'm not seeing the hands. Otherwise, I will ask Sam for the last comment if he has any other comment to give. Yes, Sam.
No further comments, only to just be sure to extend our sincerest thanks to Dr. Jessamy. I hope everyone else on the call has found it as valuable as I have. It's much appreciated. Would you like me to close formally, Prof?
Well, yeah, you can. We'll talk about next steps and then you can close here.
I'll hand to you for next steps.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So thanks again, Jessamy. This is really awesome. It's like, I don't know what kind of food to call, what kind of craving to call this that we just realized by having you with us today. We are really, really grateful. So colleagues, we continue with our usual round of seminars. We still have about 2 in the series of the seminars to hold, one on results, then one on discussion, and then of course, maybe doing your abstract and your references, and then the series will close. And we're also looking forward, hopefully, to launch another series on research protocol development. So this one on scientific writing is like putting the cart before the horse. We just decided that we have too many data and we should think of publishing them first before we begin to talk of generating new set of data. So I want to thank you all for coming on. I want to thank Greta. I can't stop thanking her for, pampering us this morning. And also to thank my colleague, Sam, for always being around to support me in this venture. Then, of course, the interpreters, I want to thank them for their, effective work interpreting this, scientific exercise to the understanding of colleagues. Colleagues, thank you for coming on board, and we look forward to having you again in the next round of seminar. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Please
Thank
be
you.
in touch. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yeah.